We don't have time for this. If you actually believe this is a cataclysmic issue, you need to basically be okay with hydrocarbons because it is the only credible bridge fuel we have to keep the world working properly. Because otherwise, what David said is right. We are going to economically destroy parts of the world by trying to race towards this net zero goal. By the way, guys, I just want to take rip the Band-Aid off. No, not even the market. McDonald's is not stupid. They understand how to use Excel. And so they'll think, well, I can amortize a robot versus actually jacking up prices, because what McDonald's understands is the sensitivity of pricing to demand for their product.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? I mean, they are the most intelligent about how they price. Anything at the sort of the lower end where you're capturing, nickels and dimes, they are the most sophisticated in understanding supply, demand, and the curves. And so to think that they're not going to just invest heavily now at the corporate level, the next franchisee of McDonald's will still pay $1 million for a franchise fee, but will be given a bevy of robots that they rent from McDonald's, and they'll have to hire half or a third less. That's the real shame of this, which is the number of people that should actually be gainfully employed in the economy will then shrink again. But in this case, it was because legislators just completely don't understand how incentives work and how the economy works. The Inflation Reduction Act, we granted CMS and Medicare the ability to negotiate drug prices. And we actually also capped the total prescription cost that any American can pay at $2,000. Now, it turns out that overwhelmingly most Americans will never spend $2,000 a year on prescription medications. But there will be a few, and they bump up against drugs that cost millions of dollars. So there's a drug for, SMA, that's like, 2.4 million, and beta thalassemia, like 2.8 million. And we will all bear the cost of that. Now, if CMS and Medicare go and really crunch those costs, what is pharma going to do? Well, pharma is going to do what is the obvious thing, which is like, if you're going to cap what I can make, I have to completely change my R&D model, and they're just going to use AlphaFold, and what it's really going to do is potentially put a bunch of research scientists out of work. And those are folks that should probably for our general future be gainfully employed, but the nature of their job is going to change completely because the economic capitalist incentive of big pharma is going to move towards technology, which is, an AlphaFold and their protein library is the equivalent of AI and automation for McDonald's. So this is where, again, governments have to be super careful that they understand what's actually happening, because they're creating incentives, I think, that they don't completely understand. What is the point? The point is these conversations can so quickly go off the rails and are not about national security and economics and quickly become about moral virtue signaling that you miss the point. The point in the United States, just to be very blunt, is that the cost of electricity has gone up by 46% in the last decade. It will go up by another 40% through 2030. So between 2010 and 2030, the cost of electricity for every single American will have effectively doubled, even though the ability to generate, particularly from wind and solar, have been reduced by 90%. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that if you look inside the P&Ls of these utilities, it actually gives you the answer. So over the next 10 years, we have to spend, as a nation, just on upgrading power lines, $2 trillion. This is all like crazy OpEx, right? CapEx improvements for sunk cost investments. Our power line infrastructure in America is 20 plus years old, 30 years old. Our generation infrastructure is pretty poor. We have all of these failures. We don't have enough peakers. We don't have ability to store energy when we need it. So if you add this all up, I do think that there's a huge economic incentive to solve it, and there are practical ways to solve it. And that's what we have to stay focused on, because if we allow the moral virtue signaling to get in the way, we're going to make some really stupid decisions. We're going to keep trying to turn off nuclear. Yeah. Another thing that Elon said, we're not going to green light shale and nat gas. we don't have time for this. If you actually believe this is a cataclysmic issue, you need to basically be okay with hydrocarbons because it is the only credible bridge fuel we have to keep the world working properly, because otherwise what David said is right. We are going to economically destroy parts of the world by trying to race towards this net zero goal. By the way, guys, I just want to take rip the Band-Aid off. Net zero by 2050, 26, it is not possible. There is zero credible plans that the world has to do it. So we have to take small incremental steps, and yes, the retaining walls could have been built better, but these are things we find, we iterate, and we solve. It was not the reason to shut down an entire mechanism of energy generation.
Stupid mistakes where they put it just too low in the wrong place. If they just put it up the hill a couple of miles, it would have been fine.
But also, if you look inside of what happened, there was enormous pressure inside of these companies to basically, take actual direct blame and responsibility. I get all of that, but these organizations were shamed into turning these things off. That is not the way to make good, smart decisions. But the most important thing, in my opinion, was the precursor to perestroika and why he did it. And as you said, this is a fairly ardent communist, although he had really interesting views. Like, he ran a very kind of open kind of Politburo where folks could debate, and he promoted a lot of young people from within, all of these interesting things. But the most important thing, and he's written about this a lot, is the reason that he embarked on perestroika was because USSR at the time had an incredibly poor work ethic, terrible productivity, and horrible quality goods. And I think that there's something to be learned by that. Because at the tail end of communism, essentially where you had central planning, central imposed economic principles, what happened? People did not feel that they had any ownership in the outcome. It's happening where we live right now. And if you look at then what happened afterwards, it became the aristocracy that basically ruled the USSR before, and then fighting against all these folks that wanted reforms. And that created the schism, which then perverted capitalism for 7 or 8 years through Yeltsin until Putin got there. And that's what created the oligarch class and really exacerbated a bunch of wealth capture by a handful of folks that may or may not have deserved it, and I'm not going to judge that. But I just think it's really important to understand that he was forced to embark on this because of all of these state central planning policies. And so it's just an important lesson for Americans in democracy. Empirical evidence, well documented, of just how it doesn't work. And I guess the thing is, we all say you just have to learn it for yourself. You'll tell your kids to not do something ad infinitum.
They got to touch the stove. Yeah. They
got to touch the stove themselves and get burned. We are about to go do that in California.
Can you imagine if people who want to be socialists here who bind to this, if they had to be in a food line or have rations? Literally, Russia had food lines, and they were rationing food in the 1980s. That's how dysfunctional it got. Yeah.
A large driver of Gorbachev basically negotiating these peace settlements with Reagan and this nuclear, demilitarization was in part because he knew he couldn't fight. They were losing. Again, this is why people should not misunderstand what Gorbachev was. He was not necessarily some democratic freedom fighter. He was a person who was observing the on-the-ground conditions of a socialist system decay their ability to compete. And so he had to capitulate before it was forced upon him. And it was because Reagan was able to sit on top of an extremely productive capitalist system that allowed him to make those investments that made that capitulation basically a fait accompli. And I think that that's another thing for a lot of us to understand, which is free market capitalism, removing these degrees of decision making, give us degrees of freedom. And I've said this before on the last pod. The great thing about the IRA and what Chuck Schumer did is actually will be written in 10 or 15 years from now, because when we get to energy independence, when every home is resilient, the national security calculus in America changes wholeheartedly overnight. The great thing is we have a running A/B test, which will show whether this state central planning can work or not. And again, if we refuse to want to listen to the examples of Russia or all of these other countries that have tried this, then so be it. We will know in the next 3 to 5 years that these policies actually don't work. And actually, that it actually accelerates the exact hellscape that they think they're trying to avoid.